Unit 6, the Jerusalem Council. Must Gentiles become circumcised like Jews? Okay, here we go. So we have now come to this amazing, important council that we find in Acts 15, and really it's summarized by the very first verse of Acts 15, which says, "And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." So here, this is a direct contradiction to the message of the cross preached by Paul, the message of Christ that Paul and Barnabas just finished going through Asia Minor and suffering greatly to be able to preach and share. And so now they are going to confront this particular problem head on. So now what happens is they come down from Antioch, down again to Jerusalem. And when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, it says in Acts 15:2, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. So after they return back from their first missionary journey, they head back down to Jerusalem to deal with this question, and we call this the Jerusalem Council. So on the timeline, we can see how this kind of falls in right after Paul's first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey. And so now we have to deal with it. What happened? So do Gentiles really need to become Jews, or do they need to be circumcised according to the Mosaic law? Well, we see in chapter 15, verse 3 and 4, they start off by sharing all that had happened, all that God had done through their mission to go and reach the Gentiles and to preach and to reach the Jews as well, and to preach the gospel message in Asia Minor on their first missionary journey. And so Peter, Paul, and Barnabas all testify of God's amazing work through them among the Gentiles. Remember, because Peter had just previously preached, and God had used him to bring Cornelius, the Gentile, to faith. And we see all that earlier on during phase 3. But now they're all recounting how the Holy Spirit is leading them to reach the Gentiles, and the specific encounters and kind of divine appointments that God had for them during those times. And so they have this council about it. And ultimately, we read it later in Acts 15, how basically they come to the decision that they create what's called kind of a law-free decree, but to be sent to all the churches, and basically answering the question to say, no, the Gentiles do not need to be circumcised according to the Mosaic law in order to receive the salvation offered by Christ on the cross. And so we see that they have this council, they come to this conclusion. And here we kind of see the summary verse to this section as phase 4 is wrapping up. The first missionary journey and the Jerusalem Council have been complete. We see this verse, Acts 15:2, that just kind of simply states the churches were strengthened in faith and they increased in number daily. So after the decree is given, after the decision is come upon in Jerusalem, they send a decree to the churches about the decision. So after that, Paul and Barnabas then return back up to Antioch, and now they want to go return to the cities they went to, which is amazing because Paul was beaten and stoned, and they were rejected, and they were driven out of the cities. But they started churches. Some people believed, and they want to go back and they want to encourage them. So Barnabas wants to bring Mark along again, but Paul does not, and we see this in Acts 15. And so he doesn't want him to come, and so they actually end up splitting up. Barnabas and Mark go down to Cyprus to return to the churches they had started there, and Paul takes this new guy, Silas, with him, and they go back up through Asia Minor. And now this begins Paul's second missionary journey, which is split now between Barnabas and Mark, which go to Cyprus, and now Paul and Silas, who go into which is going to be Eastern Europe. And so really the area is called Macedonia. So if we look here on the map, you can see how they kind of split up. So you've got Barnabas and Mark are that first line. They go down to Cyprus. And then this second line here going up through Asia Minor is Paul and Silas. So they go there, but this time they go a lot further. They go into what we would call Eastern Europe, but then it's Macedonia. Some parts are still called Macedonia, and they go down in through Greece and over to Ephesus. They go back down through Jerusalem, and then he returns back up to Antioch. So that is kind of an overview of the second missionary journey. If we hop back to the timeline for a second, we can see the Jerusalem Council right there in 49, and then we have Paul's second missionary journey, which immediately followed in 50 through 52. So what we want to do now is kind of just pause and review what we've covered. So as we look at these 8 sections, the first 6 come from the book of Acts. We have covered these first 4 in this module. We covered in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, the first Gentile believers, and into Asia Minor, which is Paul's first missionary journey. And so in our next module, we are going to switch over and we're going to cover the last 4, which are into Macedonia and Greece, which is Paul's second and third missionary journey. Then we're going to do phase 6, which is where Paul is imprisoned. First in Jerusalem, he's sent down to Caesarea and then to Rome. And then we're going to look at the rest of the New Testament books and kind of how Revelation and future prophecy fit in. And so right there, we're going to start with Paul's second and third missionary journeys. And it is during these second and third missionary journeys that he begins to write. And I'm so glad that he did, right? The church has been forever grateful that he did, because the treasures of the New Testament, the letters that we read and study that God had inspired are the letters that Paul wrote. Many of them wrote during these second and third missionary journeys. So very important stuff that we're going to see in the next module. So let's move over to module 7, and we're going to wrap up our course with this last and final module as we look at the early church, part 3, from Macedonia to Rome and the writings of the New Testament.